Thank you for joining us at Design Talks Now, the virtual version of Design Talks hosted by Design Pavilion in celebration of NYC by Design. I'm Eileen Shaw, producer of Design Pavilion, New York's premier public design exhibition, open to all and held through the public plazas of Times Square. Our event, of course, in May now has been postponed, but we're here with a daily curation of Design Talks to keep the conversations going. We're honored to share programming developed with our prestigious partners. Our series explores topics of resiliency, sustainability, humanity, and the future. And of course, we'll discuss how the world has just drastically changed. Such programming clearly and deliberately acknowledges this historic, unprecedented time. You are contributing towards its documentation, as well as inspiring what will come next. So today, we're pleased to present Driving in Circles, an exploration in creating real sustainable transportation and circular mobility. This conversation between IDSA members is informed by the IDSA's Deep Dive 2020 conference. We welcome Deb Johnson, a professor of industrial design at Pratt Institute and executive director at the Pratt Design Incubator, and Stephan Clamaneva, founding principal at Aviators, and Glenn Johnson, special interest chair for transportation for IDSA and fellow of industrial design on interior systems for Collins. And now, let's begin.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Stephan Clamaneva and I'd love to have you here. It's great to be on with Design Talks, and I want to introduce my co-MC at the upcoming Sustainability Deep Dive, Deb Johnson. Deb Johnson has been leading the integration of sustainability and technology into design education, entrepreneurship, and research since 1988. I'm proud to call her a friend, and she's recently returned to her role as Professor of Industrial Design at Pratt Institute. She served at the Chair of ID program at Pratt from 1998 to 2005. I'm super excited, that she also founded the Pratt Design Incubator in 2002, and then the Center for Sustainable Design Studies in 2008, and then the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator in 2013. She was the first woman to win the IDSA Student Merit Award in 1986 and served as the IDSA New York Chapter Chair and Northeast Regional Education Director. And I also have a special guest with us representing IDSA as well, who is leading the Transportation Special Interest section for IDSA. And he's a fellow of industrial design and lead for interior systems for Collins. He's been recognized as a technical fellow by Collins for his many contributions in civil aviation cabin environment design. He has over 30 years of industrial design and product development experience across several major transportation companies, and holds more than 30 patents and leads the discipline of industrial design. Just to introduce myself again, I describe myself as a design hybrid, focusing on systems thinking, an ideator and inventor. I use the Greek letter pi to describe myself instead of the T-shaped designer. I'm a design plus business, design value evangelist, citizen of the world, and a third culture kid. I want to kick things off. And again, we want to have this open discussion and conversation this afternoon. I'm really excited to have everybody joining us. And just to set the scene and start the conversation, I'm going to sort of take us through a couple of visuals to help us go through the topics that we're going to be covering today. So as Eileen introduced us, the question is, can we really have sustainable transportation or circular mobility? I mean, that's the question. So, with the Design Talks, I wanted to set the scene, given the fact that here we are virtual because we can't be in person because of the global pandemic. This is a picture from Times Square in New York City. For those that are joining us locally, this will be a familiar sight. And in fact, I have some interesting stats in terms of transportation that I wanted to share with you guys. Here's the numbers for 2019 for New York City in terms of the amount of people, the amount of cars, the amount of transportation, whether it's public or private, that's been happening that we would see every day in our city. And, if we fast forward to today, this is an image from very recently. It's empty, right? There's nothing left. And in fact, from a sustainability perspective, I wanted to share this little animation that shows the amount of reduction in pollution that we've had compared to last year. So with these in mind, and the only eye chart that we're going to be sharing that comes from Capgemini to sort of start to frame the conversation, I wanted to kick things off. And, with Deb, we talked about this image the other day. Wouldn't it be nice if we could, instead of going through these boring numbers, just have fun and talk about a fun image? So, what does this kind of give you when you sort of see this on the screen?
So when we were talking, I think one of the things that I really loved about this was the fun aspect of driving connected to, because the bumper cars are always connected to a grid, right? And this idea of transportation system being connected to a smart grid immediately sort of emerges as a great direction to take things in the future. And I think the way we are taking things into the future when we talk about transportation really shifting to mobility. And I think that's a great topic for conversation. What is transportation versus what is mobility? And what are the key impacts that transportation have in business?
Glenn, any thoughts that this image conjures up for you?
The mobility of the future, if we can actually move in a much easier way. What this image also says that he may not actually own this car. He may just be renting it for a short period of time, just like in a fairground. But there's a sense of enjoyment. The most amazing thing is the fact that it's in the countryside, I believe. And I'm wondering if this is the world record run of a bumper car or something, and somebody was filming it. I wonder where the source image came from.
Yeah, actually, this is a modified, it's, tricked out bumper car. And yeah, exactly. And I think it can go up to 60 miles an hour. For those gearheads or motorheads, as they call them in the UK, they'll know which auto show this came from.
I think another thing that conjures up is what were bumper cars like when you rode them in a fair as a kid. And I never liked them. I didn't like everybody hitting me randomly, people I didn't know, very aggressive against me. But when I think about bumper cars and I think about how awkward electric EV is within the transportation industry, that it spits and starts, and all of sustainability, bumper cars could be a bit of an analogy of us trying to get essentially to this ideal state that's depicted here.
Well, you use the magic word here, the ideal state. In fact, in my speaker notes, I have this idea of TRIZ, and if you were to take this ultimate final result, or IFR, what they use to describe what TRIZ is, I've sort of changed it, tweaked it a little bit to sort of ask the question: can we have an ideal sustainable product, or an ISP? Can we have the ultimate green automobile, or what would that look like, right? And can we take that concept and take it all the way to the end, where it is pure 100% clean, efficient, and it doesn't impact the environment? And that's where we should be aiming for. What we should be aiming for. If we don't get there today, that's okay, right? But we should start.
Glenn, what you said before, this idea that the consuming of products is changing, and we don't necessarily need to own things as much as to have access to things, and creating business models around that could be very effective.
I actually also wanted to comment on the industrial design of this car. The external aesthetic is so British. It's like the Reliant Robin trying to embrace some American car ideology. And then the way the bumper's above the ankle height, so it wouldn't break your leg if it run into you. It would really hurt your shin. And then the fact that to step into it, you can step into it as a child, and yet as an adult, as we see, can still use it. So it's kind of a bit of a triumph of ergonomics. But he will bash his head on those metal posts if he gets really hurt. To your point earlier, Deborah, that when you get really hit, and we have in our industry what's known as the head impact criterion. Your head flying back is actually a big part of not passing a test. So just pointing out, it's actually somebody adding this stuff who's never really been to art college by the look of it, but it's great.
this is an example of another problem that we have in the automobile industry in general is skeuomorphism, where everything has to look a certain way because of the history of how it used to be 100 years ago. And we're finding that there's an opportunity here to kind of reinvent the way mobility of the future will look like if it's sustainable. What does it have to have? Two headlights that look like eyes, and a grill that looks like a mouth, and all these things, or can we change it up? I mean, arguably, we see some of these folks out there that talk about a little bit about, or they've kind of gone inroads into these new designs that are changing things up a little bit, and it's an interesting thing to kind of look at here in the image and sort of wonder what could be coming down the pipe. Deb, unless you have something that you wanted to add, I just was going to sort of take us into the next sort of inspirational things that I wanted to kind of highlight for folks on the Zoom as well, and then cover these sort of break this conversation into 4 different quadrants, if you will. That we've already covered some of them as we were talking about this image. So I think we can kind of refer back to them if we need to. But the idea is looking at usage, looking at sort of business from a business perspective. How can we be sustainable in transportation? Technological advances will have us pushing back to reinvestigating how things might be reconsidered now that we're kind of adopting newer and newer technologies. And obviously, don't forget, as designers, we want to make sure that the brand identity is important. So with that, I'm just going to sort of throw these images out for you, focusing on the usage of things. I think you guys already talked about. I'm going to ask you sort of to comment on this, Deb, sort of the generational shift that we've seen in sort of the last 10 to 20 years and how that might be impacting things.
I think especially with Gen Z, and that's the group of people that I'm teaching right now. And I'm super excited by what they're bringing to the table. These are people who are really interested in the truth. They are radically inclusive. They have this pragmatic and analytical piece to them. They want to know where things are coming from. They want to believe in what they're doing. I think that just speaks really brilliantly to the potential for sustainable practices to become more integrated. And so I think within the idea of their transportation, as people are coming more and more to the cities, to live in cities, I think the idea of owning a car or even using a car to get places is really shifting dramatically, and especially for this group. Going back to something I said earlier, this need to have access to things, but not necessarily the ownership of things, which is very different mentality from, say, the baby boomers. Where ownership is how you define yourself. This isn't how this generation is defining themselves. And I think Generation Y too, defined as experiences rather than, again, ownership.
Well, I think that, again, you're spot on to the, what I call them the Gen Is, the folks that are, in their late teens, early 20s that have grown up with an iDevice attached, always on, always connected. And they're okay with sharing stuff that's not their own. Whereas, folks, I remember doing a workshop with a person that was from California, and to her, the biggest challenge was in coming to New York was, I have to touch things that are not my own. And to her, it was this very controversial thing. Like, I don't want to do that. And yet here we are, we get in our zip car and thousands of other people have used that, and it's okay. And it doesn't matter. We don't need it because it doesn't define who we are. We have this idea, again, going back to the conversation, Glenn, I'll pull you in on this. In the UK, it's motorheads. Here in the US, it's gearheads. We were defined in many cases, or the older, baby boomers were defined by the car, that freedom, that represented their independence. And the newer generation, they have their phone for that, right?
That's an interesting thought, because in Europe, historically, a vehicle was kind of a privilege. In America, it was almost like a rite of passage in the 50s. You're expected to have a car. And to be honest, having raised a family here. You know, people can drive at the age of 16 because, you know, if you're in a rural area where I'm located, without a vehicle, there are no real infrastructure or bus services. Whereas in many urban environments in Europe, you can get a bus or a train. And train services, especially in Europe, are fantastic. In certain cities here, the trains are amazing. And European cities have put in the crossover, the tram, and that's kind of successful in many cities. But I do think there's a difference of attitude, and I see it in Boston and New York, where people are much more liable to use public transport and ride on it and share it. I do think the car here, people actually, they go to Las Vegas and rent specific exotic vehicles for the experience and the thrill. And I'm wondering if that will always be there, or as they become more virtual, people are satisfied with the virtual aspect, or maybe they're not. That's kind of a philosophical debate about the virtual future. I do think the use of Zoom and this pandemic is going to change society with a seismic shift in the acceptable remote nature of many things, and that will also change transportation. So I think, as well as all the things we see here, post COVID-19, there will be a shift.
That's a good segue into the sort of second point on this usage component, is this idea of solving the last mile issue in, you know, smart city, you know, problems, whether it's New York or Singapore or London, Paris, you name it. It's all coming down to the last mile, because, you know, yes, we can use public transportation, but how do we get from, or we can use that shareable device, the mobility device, and I don't call it a car or vehicle on purpose because it should be something different. You know, how do we get from that common parking garage or place back to our house? And we need to have, you know, sort of that multimodal capability of that mobility device, and it has to have connections to other options that get you from that place, wherever that is, back to your physical address, right? We need to have that. And apparently to your point about Europe, according to McKinsey and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the average European car is only driven 5% of its lifetime. And that's ridiculous. And it can hold up to 5 people on average, but it only carries 1.5 people per trip. That's insane. So if we can take that ownership model and up its usage, even if it's if it's a factor of 10, we're still getting 50% of the car usage. I mean, we have a long way to go yet, right?
Actually, I really wanted to talk to that very quickly. I don't want to interrupt Deborah here, but I wanted to look at cars, and in the aerospace world, we maintain and repair things much longer than most people realize. So the average age used to be 8 years for a vehicle, and it's risen between 14 and 17 years. And I look back on the vehicles I've owned in the UK, and I have an old truck now, and I bought it specifically to pull a trailer so I could camp. And it's now gone past 208,000 miles. I can recall the time no British car would get past like 80,000 miles. And I know people who have 350, 400,000, it's kind of a rite of passage how many miles their vehicle will have. Of course, they're not as green because they've got older systems on the vehicle. But if you don't make that many of them because you can keep maintaining things, maybe that's an argument. And maybe you could upgrade the engine or whatever. But it's just the fact that people are hanging on to things more than I realized. There's 253 million cars apparently, but most of them are like 17 years old.
One of the things that's important to note as well is that most of the impact, the environmental impact of a vehicle, while a lot of it happens during the usage phase, most of it is through the manufacturing, the mining of the materials, the shaping of the materials, and the embedded energy in the parts. So the longer, and this I think pertains to almost anything, the longer you can keep something in the usage phase, the better you're doing. So it's great to hear that that cars are on the road for 17 years or 14 years on average, rather than this high turnover, this constant shifting. I'd be interested in where those cars are. Is it 14 years? I just gave up my Saab. I've had some.
That's a cool car.
With a Saab because I just love the car. But I had the car for 14 years, 15 years, and I loved it. And if it hadn't started to become unsafe to drive, I would have just kept it forever because it's the most sustainable way to kind of use something. So, I think so much of the issue could be solved just by keeping things longer.
Yeah, and I think that to your point about the, connecting manufacturing processes are important, and connecting that to the design process, I think, is also super important. And I think I just wanted to highlight that we're lucky that at the conference we're going to be having Matrix 4. Our speakers, Kyle and Patricia, are going to be talking about that connection, the new business model that they've sort of tried to create, connecting design and manufacturing processes. It's not for automobiles, but the idea is that, having that connection so that they can sort of see how they're going to be making these things in the end, has that direct connection, is super important. And I think it brings up the sort of the business component of how do we make this, how can a company now today have a new business model that really allows them to sort of be successful. And because in all honesty, the way that the current business model for automobile makers and for transportation makers in general, even if we can solve the COVID-19 situation, the model is broken. It cannot continue this way. And going back to harking to folks that we talked about before with Gen I or Gen Y and Z, they need to know that the products that they're going to be buying are honest, right? If we looked at a list of B Corps, for example, let me ask you that question. Do we see any automotive cars or transportation cars on that list of B certified companies today?
I'd have to research that. I'm not exactly sure. But this idea, I know people are trying to get there. And I think on some level, it's genuine in that the consumer is now looking at it and demanding it. They're seeing a market for it. They wouldn't go after it unless they felt there was a strong market for it. But I think more and more it's being integrated into the system. Maybe Glenn, or Stephan, what the percentage of electric vehicles are out there in the consumer transportation. There's the whole other conversation about freight trucks that are carrying goods all over the place as well. I know there are very few electric semis out there, but they're coming and they're being developed.
Yeah, they're hybrid cars. I mean, both Ford and Chevy, they make hybrid versions of their trucks, to my knowledge. And like we talked about Tesla, they're the first to come out with an all electric truck, I believe.
I've seen Volvo have got test vehicles and Mercedes-Benz. I've seen that. In fact, Volvo and Mack trucks are located in Greensbury near me. We know the design team a bit. I think the issue right now is there's so much vaporware when it comes to these electric vehicles. I keep seeing all these announcements of these electric cars and it being shown at a show. And I went to CES last year, it was just absolutely inundated with self-driving electric vehicles from Japan, from China. And the thing is, you don't see these things for sale. And I'm a wee bit worried of this situation because I'm showing my age. I worked for Dragon Design, a lady called Dorothy Mackenzie in the UK, in London at one point. And there was a big push for green design at that moment, especially with programs on washing up liquid and the effect on the environment. And there was a phrase from that period in Britain called greenwashing. I don't know if it still exists, where people just, they say they're going to do this stuff, but they don't actually do it, And if you actually judge, like you go back to the honesty in Generation Y and Z, judge people by their actions, not what they say. The one company I do know, Nissan, with the Leaf, has really, really followed that. And I think Chevy got to be applauded because the Volt is a real vehicle, and you see them around. And I found it very funny when apparently I helped somebody, she'd got out of a Chevy Volt and she couldn't remember where the gas filling cap was on the actual car because she just hadn't used it. And I think that's awesome. You know, she had never driven anywhere far enough to actually use any of the gas in it. So
yeah, my hybrid, I had a Volkswagen Jetta hybrid for years, and I every time my wife and I had to fill it up with gas, we would forget which side it was on because we literally would drive for 550 miles on one tank of gas, and the tank only had 11 gallons. So if you know anything about cars, you'll know that it's a pretty small gas tank, and yet we could drive this thing to Boston easily and not even have to fill up once. Super easy. It's insane. And to that point, I think this is where we need to be thinking about this. This idea of honest products. Again, another great speaker we have, Stephan from the CEO from Cake Motorcycles, is going to be talking about his concept for their new product. It's an electric bicycle, but they've taken besides the sustainability metrics they're going to be sharing with us, they talked about this idea of modularity so that they can have one basic option that can be configured for multiple uses so that they can be set up for something. First of all, you change the way that you don't use the vehicle in the same way every day. It changes. And then it also changes over time. As you grow older, your needs change, your what you have to do every day changes, and that can grow and adapt with you. That's a great example, and we're going to be hearing more about it in come June. These are examples where we need to kind of push the car manufacturers to really invest in ventures that can push technology so that we can test these things out, like Formula E, for example. Why don't we do more of that? Because if we saw all the automotive technology that's in our cars today, ABS and traction control and everything, adaptive steering and cornering, all these things, they came out of technology that was developed for Formula One. So if we could focus on Formula E and get that technology to be adopted and driven there, where the money can be made in advertising, we could get a lot of stuff of this, these new sustainable sort of, instead of evolutionary, we can really make it a revolutionary option for us.
I'd like to talk about that because everyone goes on about the wonderful world of Formula One, but at the end of the day, the composites, the carbon fiber of Formula One, that's all aerospace stuff. It was invented to make the rocket nozzles on the Saturn V, and also for the composite, the balsa wood sandwich that was in early aircraft. And then the disc brakes everyone goes on about, that are now going on mountain bikes. They came out from trying to stop an aircraft because they get so hot. So everyone thinks Formula One's really cool and it's turned into Formula E, but I'm just trying to remind everyone, some of the coolest and lightest and strongest ideas came out of airplanes.
I mean, I think, it goes, but this is a great segue to kind of talk a little bit about sort of technology, materials, and tools that we, for the trade, because that's also sort of, I think, super important. If we're going to really become sustainable, we're going to have to be leveraging some of this stuff. And Deb, you and I, I think we both talk about this very strongly. But you led this at the BFA for years, so I'd like you to sort of comment on that. Your experience with that and all the startups that you kind of focused on, because you were in the middle of materiality every day.
I think the BFDA, Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, its goal was to help nurture emerging companies, mostly in the fashion industry, and to use their values, their core values around wanting to do no harm to the environment, wanting to do no harm to people who are producing their products. The goal was to start and embed those values at the beginning. So as they made material choices, they made better choices than kind of the easy choice. It required research, it required going to factories and really understanding how factories were working. But the goal, in essence, was to build these sustainable companies from scratch. I think it's much harder to change existing cultures, and harder still to change existing cultures of public companies. That's why I landed in this area. It was because I felt that, again, starting from scratch, you had the best opportunity to create the culture rather than to change cultures. And we launched, I think, about 38 businesses. We were constantly sourcing possible materials for people. And then there's the understanding of when sustainability can kick in. So you might not be able to kick in a material choice that's ideal until you're scaled up enough that you can buy that material and bring it into your production loop. And so we had strategies for sort of every step of the way. And often people would start with packaging and really, being innovative around the packaging and how they were distributing things. And then certainly where they were having things made using renewable materials, using lower impact materials. So we were what I call the chief sustainability officer of each one of our companies. Because sustainability, it's huge, and a lot of people avoid it because it comes at you like a tidal wave. And my inclination when I started first thinking about reducing impacts and seeing how complex a problem it is to solve, and there's no perfect solution. But my inclination was to turn and run, and I think that's generally people's inclination. And I managed to sort of stay in there, and then you start to learn, and you learn more, and you learn more, and you learn more. Eventually it starts to feel like comfortable territory. But my heart goes out to big businesses that are trying to make this change. They have so much embedded knowledge about how they do things now. And it's very hard to change the inputs and outputs on that kind of a system. It takes a lot of work. Systems are slow to change, but we have to. We have no choice.
Sure. Well, to that point, I think we have to at least acknowledge the fact that companies like Ford have redefined, they've rebranded themselves. They call themselves the mobility company now. They're no longer an automobile company, and so that's at least it's a step in the right direction.
This is what we're going to do. You have companies like Patagonia or Eileen Fisher that are not so publicly held, where you can make big, bold statements. Leadership can make bold statements about what their goals are around sustainability. And they are able to define and use those markers as signs of success. So if my boss says, I want it more sustainable, I know that I'm going to get recognized and potentially a raise for making something more sustainable. I mean, it's a simple case, but effectively that's what's going on. So it's critical that leadership comes in and says, this is important to our brand. And I think more and more companies are using ethics as a guide to how they're going to grow their companies in the future. But again, there's a lot that needs to change within a company in order to effectively make, not just within the company, but within society. People have to get comfortable with electric vehicles. They need to get comfortable with new materials, new forms, potentially, more community, just the idea of communal vehicles, for example, those kinds of things. There's a lot to adopt and change. It won't happen unless we set radical goals and just try to make it happen.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull out one word specifically to all you said, and you use the word form to to ask the question to Glenn here. 3D printing has provided us an opportunity here to do something very interesting, is leveraging biomimicry principles, shapes that we find in nature that are very hard to make using traditional manufacturing processes. Have you seen generative design, for example, take on, replacing design principles so that they can be manufactured in less traditional methods using 3D printers, for example?
So today I'm here as Glenn Johnson of transportation section of IDSA, but you're aware of my background. And in the portfolio of companies that I work with, we're kind of leaders of 3D printing. We typically we have a suite of machines that will do a variety of different materials for the aerospace and also military and other fields. One of the benefits of 3D printing that isn't obvious to the outside world is if you've got a very difficult material like titanium, you can sinter titanium and make shapes with no loss. You don't have to machine it later. Well, you do machine it, but to a lesser degree. The issue with it is the knowledge set of using it. It's usually slower. That's the biggest thing. Everyone's 3D printing masks and PB, protective stuff. You could probably just thermoform them much quicker and make them by hand. Yeah. So 3D printing, in fact, we had a specialist. We lost him in our own department. He's ended at Carbon. And you probably know the Carbon company. They provide for Adidas the springy shoe, for want of a better word. 3D printing can make some amazing materials. There's usually some post-processing to get it to look really attractive because of the layered surfaces that occur. Yes, the three-dimensional topology that can go into a structure that takes load, you can create skeletons that can be pretty enough to be put on display like that wheel we're looking at there and the shoes above it. I also want to go back to that truck on the top left. Someone's loved that truck long enough for it's like 70 years old. It's probably older than any garage it lives in today. And I think if you make objects that are pretty enough, like when I came to the States, I got a really nice American electric guitar. That's an old guitar, If we can successfully make designs that can appeal to somebody's soul, if they've used 3D printing or another technology to be manufactured, it doesn't really matter. It's the quality of the initial design. People, have certain artifacts that they cherish and look after them and repair them. And back to Deborah's point earlier, if things can be kept and maintained, maybe that's also sustainable. So I'm trying to cover both. I'm trying to segue between 3D printing and the design of a product. I don't think 3D printing should just be applied because we have a 3D printer. And in many ways, people forget that 5-axis machining is an incredibly successful way of doing it if you can recycle the parts that you've cut off. So we would make a lot of aluminum components and machine them and then just take the swarf and melt it down and make more stuff. And right. So I do think if you design from the get-go to disassemble, repair, and when you make something, to Deborah's point, if you source really expensive batteries full of rare earth, is that more sustainable than making something that's a smaller engine that can be repaired? It's a very good question.
You really get to the argument around, solving the black swan problem with the green swan, but then you get some black feathers on the green swan. You have cobalt for batteries, and yet you want the electric car. I know we're running short on time, but I was reading this morning something talking about how designers need to design in resiliency, and that's critical, that we need to be thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, that we're going to give 60 more seconds here to wrap up the last point I wanted to draw on, which is just get your quick thoughts on the brand. We covered some of this already, but the idea of we're going to be hearing later early in June about Loop and companies like TerraCycle, how they've sort of taken traditional brands and recreated something or created a higher value product in these organizations to create closed loop systems or circular systems for companies by increasing the value of their brand. So reimagining traditional brands, maybe it's in perishable goods or CPG companies, which had this tremendous amount of waste in packaging. But there's an opportunity for that point that you were making earlier, Deb, about branding. You can take that and increase the value of a brand by applying those sort of high valued products, strategies for closed loop and circular systems to these traditional, like for example, coated paper for ice cream. Now you put it in a beautiful aluminum can that's designed by Loop, and it's now you're creating almost like an experience. So they want to take it back to the supermarket and get a new one because it builds in that new sort of experience.
Well, thank you. We will start our Q&A period. We have our first question from Jason Belair. European car use, according to EFM, is 5% of its lifetime. Are we or are we not looking into creating new models of sharing as a result? Not thinking of Lyft or Uber services, are we bound to insurance models and lawyers as a result? Looking at Electrolux and how they are taking back vacuum cleaners and fixing them, then leasing it back out is proving to be a great business model. Profitable and inspiration for transportation, he asks.
Guys, anybody want to take it? I mean, I think that's a great question, Jason. I would say, we have to, put the feet to the fire for these car manufacturers to really say, ultimately they are responsible for creating those closed loop systems now. So, obviously, arguably a Electrolux with a vacuum cleaner is a little bit of a lower cost, and it's not the same order of magnitude as a car. However, that's where, using the analogy of loop, if you can build it into the system, and it's not just, if you're done with it, well, let's recycle it, and it's kind of up to the consumer. Build it into the system, create that closed loop so that they are more either using, your point, Glenn, about maybe there's a second life. Maybe you can repurpose it. Maybe it's designed in a way that it can be taken apart and reused. There are standardized parts. There's a whole other strategy that we should be focusing in on. I think that's a good point. That's definitely a good point. Guys, you wanted to comment on anything?
I think there are interesting things to consider in terms of maybe you don't have to change the vehicle, but you can change the technology and replace things technologically. I know the Sony, I think it was the S car that was at CES this year. I mean, Sony's not getting into the car business, but they really want to develop their technologies for driving systems as well as entertainment systems, so they can start to come in. But we designed at BFDA a jacket that had a marker on it that was just woven in. You didn't really notice it, but when you pointed a cell phone at it, it had an effect that happened. On the premise that, well, instead of changing the shirt because you wanted a new shirt, you change the little app so something else comes out, just to promote owning things for longer.
And that's the car behind you. The image that we're showing is the car from Sony from CES. And in fact, to that point, if you went to CES, like Glenn said, you saw car companies presenting themselves as tech companies and tech companies presenting themselves as car companies. It was hilarious. I mean, you had the collaboration of Mercedes-Benz with James Cameron showcasing the Avatar concept car. I mean, it is, there's too much to cover, and I know that we're running out of time. I don't know if...
We have a few more questions that I think we'll have time to review. Okay. Richard Lombard asks, who should press these changes? If business is funding government, there is minimal bite there. However, consumer demand has proven to lack momentum. What are your thoughts?
Well, for me, I immediately think we're sending money to all these companies to help bail them out and keep them going. And can we attach the sustainability to that? Can we attach decarbonization, for example, of their production change and ask for these changes at a time when we have a lever to sort of insist at a much bigger level than a consumer level. It's very hard for an individual consumer. It's so frustrating to insist on change. It depends on what I buy, and that's all I can do. But here we have an opportunity, not just in the transportation industry, but any of the industries, the airplane industry, for example, Glenn, where can we go in there and say, you've got to do better. If we're going to give you this money, put some ties against that.
We have a unique opportunity. Glenn?
I would actually say what's amazing about American society is how fast it can change. So I'm just holding up an iPhone here, and you had a great image of Blackberries, and it was quite interesting how quickly the Blackberry was dropped. And then we had the Razor for a period of time. And then that was dropped. And then we've gone on to the iPhone. The reason I bring that up is people will do things as consumers if they think it's cool. So I've actually tried to answer that question, and I'll go back to my textual answer is, at the moment, Formula E and the Formula E motorbikes are about to eclipse the piston-engined versions. And I will say when they do that, that means that the old technology will just be dropped because it's no longer cool. And I was reminded of this. Does the designer create the taste for society, or does the society the designer lives in dictate the taste the designer uses? It's a kind of yin and yang. And I think when it comes to sustainability, we will leap onto sustainability as a population when we feel that that's exactly what we should be doing. And I know there's some early adopters, and I try to repair as many things as I can and not waste things and recycle. But I think as soon as the products come out, and that's the car industry, and in aircraft, there's a big push to being incredibly lightweight and extremely durable already. Mm-hmm. Things will improve. And I think in trying to legislate change, it's always tougher to actually change society when you legislate them into shape. And I think we've seen nations fall apart when they've tried to legislate their society.
That's an interesting point. We have a question here from Luis Espinosa. Looking at the numbers of a specific case, Manhattan, the amount of cars, buses, etc., being used before the pandemic hit us is astonishingly large. Luis believes that this is an unsustainable model. What do you think the future will look like once we embrace community mobility? And I'm going to add to that question a bit. I know that our city planners are looking ahead now post-COVID, and they're talking about plans that they foresaw for 2030, having to bring them into the picture a lot earlier than was expected. And that's in planning our streets and highways according to what they think the needs will be now post-COVID. What are you hearing, and what do you think about the future of community mobility and how cities and towns must plan for it?
Well, I can just point out, guys, that we did a project, well, during my tenure at the design studio for Dassault Systems, we worked with a lot of cities to sort of figure out what the custom solution would be for that particular city. Every city will require a different solution. The one that I'm referring to specifically is in Grenoble. So the topology in the city of Grenoble in France was such that they had to use gondolas, like above ground mobility. So the idea was you needed to have multimodal, and so it was using, to Luis's point, the same basic infrastructure or design for the actual mobility device for different things during different days, different times of the day as well. So in the morning, you're carrying people to work. In the middle of the day, you're probably moving things, cargo, deliveries, all sorts of different things like that around the city. And in the afternoon, you're taking people back to work, from work back to their house, and then you're moving refuse at night. So the idea is that you have one system that can that can be modular, that can be connected to one's environment, that allows you to move different things at different time, but the design is very similar. And that's what we proposed for the city of Grenoble. The thing that we touched on last year during actually the design talks in Times Square, Eileen, that you hosted us last year, was the future mobility for New York City. And that question was heavily discussed during that time. And sort of the things that we covered there were, New York is going to have to stop thinking that car is king. That's the problem with all of our cities in the United States today. It's about moving humans around and, how to make their life easier. So it goes back to, it's a design problem. So we are, here we are, I have two designers in front of me, and I'm talking to them, and, it has to be a human-centered solution. So we have to focus on the humans, not the car. So more lanes is not the solution. It's about what are the use cases for the humans that are living in the city. And that's really how we're going to drive the solution for this problem.
And that would be the transformative change for me. Again, we've closed down, 40 miles of streets in New York City.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
why reopen them? Why not reconfigure them to be much more suited for pedestrian, scooters, bikes, those sorts of behaviors? I think the one thing that these challenges to the world create are opportunities to shift the model, because everybody's now used to those 40 miles of pedestrian streets. So I think there are opportunities to be taken if our policymakers can leverage it and do something with it.
Now's the time. Glenn, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I'm involved in another project which is involving people with restricted mobility. And I know of a project with a research facility in Italy that we're connected with that is part of Otis, and in a hospital environment, they will actually take a wheelchair with a person, get the elevator to operate, show up, take you to another floor, then go to the next bed that you need to go to. And that's got me thinking about, well, it doesn't need to be a wheelchair, it could be another vehicle. In the 80s, Clive Sinclair had a vehicle known as the C5. It was an electric vehicle. It would be perfect in a closed city to go and visit tourist sites and everything. And now we have a lot of these bike shares and electric bikes, and they've kind of really done what Clive Sinclair was trying to do. But I do think the more we think about people that are going to struggle to get from point A to point B, the better the environment will be anyway, because you're allowing people that are probably trapped at home to go to other places. And I was really heartened when I visited Disneyland, the fact that on the rides, the people that probably didn't have a very long life expectancy or had issues, medical issues, were always shown the front. There it is. That's that image I was looking for earlier. They're given the first opportunity. And as designers, it's our job, like Ralph McQuarrie and Sid Mead, we should think to the future. We should dream. We should show society how we could be, because if we don't, who is?
That's right. Well, that's a perfect point for us to end on. Thank you so very much, Stephan, Deb, and Glenn, for your insights, for sharing your work and your thoughts. We all look forward to IDSA's deep dive. And thank you all, the audience, for joining us. Please do so again at the next Design Talks Now. You'll find topics and presenters and information on our new Design Pavilion website, so visit us there. And for now, stay safe, stay smart. Design stands together.